when it says the Old Testament closes, does that mean that like this stuff is still in the Old Testament, but just recorded?
Nope, that means Malachi is written and the Old Testament is complete, and time continues on so into the intertestamental period,
Okay.
which lasts from about 425 to 5 BC when Jesus is born, approximately. And there's nothing written in scriptures. That's actually where a lot of the apocryphal books, so the Catholic Apocrypha, land. Is some of them are history books that land in that era. Some of them are other places, and some of them are additions to books like Daniel and Esther and such in the Old Testament. But there's several history books that land in between there that are probably very accurate history, just not considered Jewish canon. So that covers the period of the Maccabees and fleshes out the history that Daniel prophesies in Daniel chapter 11. We'll probably cover that the last day in May, so we'll get some of that. All right. So today is the last day of the divided monarchy, and we can move into the exile next week. We've been here since January, I think.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. A lot of things happen. A lot of the Old Testament. So we're wrapping up today 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, where we have been hanging out for a very long time. And most of the book of Jeremiah, but not quite all of it. And we're covering Lamentations and then 3 last minor prophets that fall in this time frame as well. And then we will be down to just a handful of books left that we have not covered. So today we're covering the fall of Jerusalem. Next week we'll look at the exile. And then after that, we will look at Ezra and Nehemiah after they've returned to Jerusalem and Judah. We have Mother's Day off. Esther is on May 14th, and May 21st is a little bit to be determined. That's our last day, and we'll conclude this spring. So, the fall of Jerusalem. Like I mentioned, this is one of the few things in the Bible that is talked about 4 or 5 times over, one of the more significant events recorded in the scriptures. Getting to it, we go through 4 more kings in the line of David. 3 of these 4 are actually direct sons of Josiah, and one of them is a grandson. We'll make those connections here as we get through them. Jehoahaz has an alternate name. His name is also Shallum. He reigns for just a mere 3 months. He was 23 years old. That was in the year 610, which is on multiple handouts you've got there. After him, his brother Jehoiakim gets to reign for a full whopping 11 years. His name originally was Eliakim. That actually means the same thing. It's just God something. Akim and Akim is the same, and they just shifted the beginning of it from God to Yahweh. So he's 25 years old when he becomes king, reigns the 11 years. His son Jehoiakim only gets 3 months on the throne at the age of 18. That's in the year 599. And we'll find out how he loses the throne shortly. And then we conclude with Zedekiah, who is the 3rd son of Josiah to get the throne. He reigns 11 years, from 599 to 588.
Sorry, did you say that he was related to them or not?
Yep, he was the 3rd son of Josiah.
Okay.
So if you look at the genealogy there, it shows how that works out. So you have Josiah, and then he's got 3 sons who end up being king. 2 of them do not have a son take the throne. Jehoiakim has a son, Jehoiakim, They make it as confusing as possible. He actually ends up being king for 3 months. He gets deported to Babylon and released 28, 30 years later, something like that. And his grandson Zerubbabel, we'll find out next week, leads the Israelites, or the people of Judah, back to Jerusalem. So that's why those last two guys are thrown in there. And those are all in the lineage of Jesus, actually, too. Alright. So Jehoahaz. So if you remember, Josiah goes to battle against Pharaoh Necho of the Egyptians, and he's not supposed to. Pharaoh Necho says, "The Lord told me to go fight against Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Don't oppose me, or it will bring your ruin." Josiah doesn't believe him and goes and fights against him and loses. He gets mortally wounded and then dies in Jerusalem. Well, Pharaoh Necho was still on his way up to go fight in Babylon, and 3 months go by, and that's the 3 months that Jehoahaz is on the throne. People of Judah put him on the throne. He's an evil king. Nothing is really attributed to him. He doesn't reign very long. Pharaoh Necho, while he's up north getting ready to fight against the king of Babylon, sends for him and imprisons him, takes him off the throne. He's actually imprisoned first in the city of Hamath, which, if you look on your map of the Middle East there, is well north of Israel. And then, I believe I have Hamath on there, right?
Yeah.
So that's where Pharaoh is at the time after defeating Josiah. And after shackling him in bronze, later Pharaoh takes him down to Egypt, and Jehoahaz dies in Egypt, in prison presumably. And Necho sets up a tributary status for Judah since he defeated them. So the kings of Judah were then paying tribute to Pharaoh down in Egypt. That is very short-lived, though, because he lost in the battle of Carchemish to Babylon. So his brother Jehoiakim is put on the throne by Necho. He too is an evil king. He reigns 11 years, and the excitement happens in the 3rd year of his reign. Nebuchadnezzar starts sweeping up all the territories that Egypt was trying to establish as tributary vassals. So remember, the Assyrian Empire had just fallen, and Babylon and Egypt were both stepping into the vacuum. They crash into each other on the Euphrates River. Egypt loses that battle and then retreats back into Egypt, and Babylon's army marches from the Euphrates River all the way down to the border of Egypt, and they clean up all of those territories and make them vassals and tributary states to Babylon.
So we get some of the background geopolitics too.
Yes,
It's fun.
that's what's happening here tonight, and it's crazy complicated in this period of time. So in that process, Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to the city of Jerusalem quite successfully. We don't exactly know how it all plays out, but what happens is Judah becomes a vassal state to Babylon, and that lasts for 3 years under Jehoiakim. This is the time that Daniel and his 3 friends and the other princes of Judah are carted off to Babylon and exiled. So this is known as the first exile out of Jerusalem and Judah. And this is also when Nebuchadnezzar takes the articles of the temple to Babylon, and they'll feature next week as well during the exile period. And this year actually marks the 70 years Jeremiah prophesies. They begin at this point in time. So Jerusalem has not been destroyed yet. Judah is not completely desolate, but a prophetic clock is ticking. And this is prophesied in Jeremiah 25. Jeremiah says, this whole country will become a desolate wasteland, and these nations will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. But when the 70 years are fulfilled, I will punish the king of Babylon and his nation, the land of the Babylonians. That's part of a larger prophecy. But the key thing here is the 70 years is connected to the nations serving the king of Babylon. And if you jump over to Daniel chapter 1, we find exactly that thing happening. It says, then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace.
So I would be safe from this.
What now?
So I would be safe from this.
Why would you be safe?
Quick to learn.
Oh. I don't know. I can't be a judge of that, actually. But anyhow, so that's the marker for that 70 years there. And we'll make some more connections with that as time goes on. But the exile itself is kind of complicated, as you'll learn by the end of tonight and as we go through it next week. So Jehoiakim is still on the throne, even though Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to it and defeats them. He doesn't knock Jehoiakim off the throne, he just switches his tributary status. And so this was actually an easy way for tributary states to get off lightly, is if they had been paying tribute to one empire and another one is on their doorstep, they just offer, I could pay tribute to you instead. And that's exactly what he did. But he only did it for 3 years. And then since he was at the furthest border of Babylon, he thought maybe he could get away with independence. So he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. At that point in time, Judah's neighbors begin raiding all of Judah. And the writer of 2 Kings attributes this mess going on in Judah to all the innocent bloodshed by Manasseh, which was 4 generations back, but he was that king who filled Jerusalem with innocent blood. And it said God was not willing to forgive.
That's saying
So
something.
Which is saying something.
So which of the kings did the child sacrifices, and why is that not considered innocent blood?
That probably is some innocent blood. Ahaz also did the child sacrifice. So Manasseh did all 4 of those. It's just he's the only one that says he filled the streets of Jerusalem with innocent blood. So apparently he was not justly judging the Israelites and executing righteous people, even though they shouldn't be. So that's the implication by that, is righteous people were being put to death for things they did not commit. And that's above and beyond worshiping the starry host and bowing down to Baal and sacrificing children to other gods. So that's where Manasseh just takes it one notch further, perverting justice. There we go. So it's kind of fuzzy as to how we shift from Jehoiakim to Jehoiakim. If you noticed in the reading, there's very little said about these kings in 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, and most of what we know about this era actually comes out of the book of Jeremiah, which is kind of like they took a deck of cards, threw it in the air, and then put it back together as mishmashed as possible. There's 52 chapters in Jeremiah, and it's hard to find 2 of them that are actually in order.
I was looking at the reading, it's like 30, 29.
Yes, that's my best attempt at getting it to be read chronologically, where you go from one king to the next king to the next king. And it's not too difficult, because usually Jeremiah says in the 4th year of so-and-so's reign, in the 6th month, this is what I said. And so you can actually do that. It's just when it was compiled, it was not compiled in anything close to a historical order. And so if you read through the book of Jeremiah, you jump from one king's reign to the next king's reign, back to this guy's reign, then you're talking about this other one who only reigned for 3 months, and it is just a mess. So that's why those chapters are in the order specified. Jehoiakim loses his life, and his son gets put on the throne. Nebuchadnezzar's army is outside the gates of Jerusalem when this happens, so I'm not exactly sure how this takes place. Maybe Jehoiakim gets assassinated, maybe he dies of some other natural causes. We don't know how Jehoiakim actually dies, but his son ends up on the throne, and he has a very short reign, 3 months, maybe 3 months and 10 days. But he actually is the only guy who surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar just outright. And Nebuchadnezzar's there because his father had rebelled and was no longer paying tribute, and that's a really good way to get an imperial army on your doorstep. So he surrenders to Nebuchadnezzar, and this is the second exile to Babylon. And this is taking place in the year 599. And this is when Ezekiel ends up getting taken to Babylon. Ezekiel's prophetic book is dated to this year. So when he talked about in the 12th year of his exile, that's how far out he learned of the fall of Jerusalem.
So how much, like how far away is this from the first exile?
We went from 607 to 599, so 8 years went by. Mhm. And this is when a very large number of people get taken into exile. There's 7,000 fighting men, the whole king's household, his mother, his wives, and some of his children, but not all of them. 1,000 craftsmen and artisans. Nebuchadnezzar is essentially cherry picking the cream of the kingdom of Judah to take and embellish Babylon and make it stronger, wealthier, and better. I don't know if I really would have wanted to be conscripted into his army, but he had 7,000 Jews fighting in his army after that. And of course he emptied the temple treasury and carted all of that off as well. So that was a short 3-month reign. He was the son of Jehoiakim, so then his uncle, who actually is younger than him, gets put on the, or maybe just a few years older. Yeah, they're really close in age, but it's his uncle. Oh, I forgot one more thing. Jeremiah 24 references the exile of Jehoiakim, and it's a really fascinating lesson because he has a vision of 2 baskets of figs. And one basket is full of really good figs, and one basket is full of just terrible, awful figs so bad that you just had to throw them out. And everybody in Jerusalem was talking in those days about how the people that got exiled to Babylon must have been awful, terrible, filthy people that God had to take them and exile them away. And God reverses that perspective, and he says the exiles were the good figs, and he was going to watch over them and bring them back, and everyone who is left in Jerusalem were the bad figs, and God was going to send sword, famine, and plague. So it's an interesting example of God sorting out the righteous from the wicked to spare the righteous from the calamity that was coming. This is just 11 years before the siege of Jerusalem takes place, and God pulled the righteous people out of there, including Ezekiel, but not including Jeremiah. He was righteous, but he was still in Jerusalem. God spares him another way. So then we're into the 4th king here. This is the 3rd son of Josiah to actually get onto the throne. His name was Mattaniah, and Nebuchadnezzar changes it to Zedekiah. And he too rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And there's a chapter in Jeremiah that seems to hint at Zedekiah inviting all the envoys of all the neighboring tributary states to Jerusalem as if they were going to conspire together to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. Because Jeremiah is instructed by the Lord to send messages through these envoys back to all of those kingdoms, saying that you do not want to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. If you do, you will all die by sword, famine, and plague, and you want to serve the king of Babylon, and if you don't, then you're rebelling against God, and you are going to all perish.
So were they still going back for the Passover stuff?
People from Babylon?
The people from
I don't think no. If they were exiled to Babylon, they did not come back to Jerusalem. They were parked over there.
So what did they do to do that?
I don't think they did. They had to cook up an interesting system. We'll talk about that some next week. But yeah, they were very far outside the kingdom, out of range of being able to go to the temple to celebrate the Passover, and they had to figure out what they were going to do. And there's actually a pretty famous passage out of Jeremiah that everybody quotes out of context today about how I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord, plans to prosper you and this, that, and everything.
Yeah.
That is part of the letter Jeremiah writes to those exiles that had been taken to Babylon in Jehoiakim's day, and how God had a plan to prosper them, preserve them. But he also said, you're going to be there for 70 years, and you need to get ready to settle down, find wives and for your sons, find husbands for your daughters, plant gardens, sow crops. You're not coming back anytime soon. And they didn't.
It's reassuring in a sense.
Yep. It's reassuring, but there was hope that they would end up coming back ultimately, just not anytime soon. All right. So back in Jerusalem, meanwhile, Jeremiah is encouraging everybody, keep the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar on you, and he actually said this with a yoke on his neck. He was a really visual prophet, so he gets a yoke and parks it on his neck and walks around and hands messages to envoys saying, keep the yoke of Nebuchadnezzar on your neck. Don't throw it off, or it will go bad with you.
It's a good way to make sure people remember.
Uh-huh.
That
Yes.
one crazy guy. that was
Crazy
wearing a
guy
yoke.
in Jerusalem. Yes.
Look at the crazy stuff.
Ezekiel had some crazier things that he had to do. This is one of the tamer chapters of his time. So Ezekiel is over in Babylon, and the year is 593 approximately, and he has a vision where it's an out-of-body experience for Ezekiel, because he says, I was lifted up between the earth and the heavens, and I could see this, and he was taken to the temple, even though he's in Babylon, somewhere else. And he actually sees the glory of the Lord lifting and departing from the temple. And this is just a few years before the siege takes place. But he sees the glory of God leave the temple, and that's the glory cloud that came during Solomon's dedication to the temple. When the temple fills up with smoke and the priests aren't even able to offer sacrifices because the smoke is so thick. Jeremiah sees a vision of that, and he sees it leaving with cherubim, departs to the east, and moves out of Jerusalem. And that's an ominous sign if I've ever heard of one.
Uh-huh.
Do we have any idea where? Oh, is it just disappearing for the time, or was it going somewhere?
Went to the east.
No.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, but that is the direction that everybody approaches the temple from. So it went out the front door. It's kind of exactly the same direction that Adam and Eve were exiled out of the Garden of Eden, actually. They went and lived to the east of Eden.
Isn't Babylon east of there actually?
And Babylon is east of there, yep. I can't think of anything else specifically, other than there's a couple passages when they're rebuilding the temple that talks about the glory of that temple being greater than the glory of Solomon's temple, even though it was smaller. But that's referring to Jesus coming to the second temple. We'll get to that in the return era, a few weeks. So then the siege comes. Zedekiah revolts and rebels again because they just don't learn their lesson. He lays siege to Jerusalem on the 10th day, the 10th month of the 9th year, and this is going to be in the year 590 BC. And the siege lasts until the 9th day of the 4th month of the 11th year, so that is approximately 18 months. I think it's 14. Let's see, 10. Nope. Should be 18 months. And Jeremiah goes through the gory details of what was going on inside the city of Jerusalem. Was that in the reading, Annabelle? Did you read through
I don't know if I got that.
some of it? He gets thrown into a cistern and then pulled out of a cistern.
Oh yeah, I got to that.
The cistern was mostly empty, but it was just mud at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And the king says, you make sure Jeremiah eats bread as long as there's bread in the food in the city,
And then they run.
and then they run out. So food runs out 18 months after the siege begins, and then the walls are broken through. And this is in the year 588 BC. Zedekiah and the army leave. They bust out through the walls. They get chased down. It would have been a very weak army after starving for 18 months. And they get captured. And it does not go well for Zedekiah. So Zedekiah's sons are killed right in front of him, and then they gouge his eyes out. So the last thing he got to see was his sons being put to death by the sword. He gets shackled and imprisoned in Babylon, and no more is heard of him. He dies there in prison, presumably. And then Babylon breaks down the walls of Jerusalem. They burn down the temple. They burn down the palaces. They burn down the houses of Jerusalem. And this is when the third exile takes place. And this is normally when we think of the exile actually beginning, but this is actually the third time Jews are carted off from Jerusalem over to Babylon. Daniel goes in the first round, Ezekiel goes in the second round, Zedekiah and some of the survivors go in the third round. There actually aren't that many people that survived that actually got exiled. Only 832 people got exiled at this point in time in 588.
Oh gosh.
A much larger contingent went earlier. Took some of the poorest. Every time they take another socioeconomic run, so they take some of the poorest of the people, all of the remaining craftsmen, and they appoint Gedaliah to be the governor of Judah. They didn't completely depopulate Judah at this point in time. And we'll talk about what happens with Gedaliah next week. But Gedaliah is the grandson of Josiah's secretary, Shaphan. Their line stayed prominent and significant in Jerusalem. And so he ends up being the governor of Judah for the Nebuchadnezzar for a short period of time. Jeremiah gets released, and so the fall of Jerusalem is actually a good day for Jeremiah because all of a sudden he's set free from his shackles and he's been given freedom, and he can go wherever he wants to go in the land. He could go to Babylon. If he wanted to go to Babylon, he could stay in the land. Said if you stay in the land, stay with Gedaliah and help him establish order. So if you can imagine being a governor of a territory that just had the capital city burned down, all the fields devastated by war, population largely moved out, and the people that are left are the poorest of the poor of the poor. It'd be a very interesting place to govern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is the third exile. I thought that was the last exile, but in a deep discussion with the Jehovah's Witnesses, I actually discovered that a few years later, a fourth group of people get exiled. We'll cover that next week. Because that's... they just keep taking people from Judah. But anyway, anybody have any questions over the historical portion there? That is how Jerusalem falls. Jeremiah gives the detailed, gritty version of it. It's really superficial in the Kings and Chronicles version. So Jeremiah covers much, much more. Looking at a few other books, like I mentioned about the book of Jeremiah, the book is 52 chapters compiled together in a very random order. Some of it are prophecies, some of it are stories. There's a few visions he has, and they are mismatched chronologically. There might be a literary connection to it, but you remember there was a story in there where Jehoiakim, who's one of those wicked kings, was having the words of the scroll of Jeremiah read to him, and every 3 or 4 lines he would cut off that section of the scroll and then burn it in the fire.
Yeah.
So Jeremiah had to re-prophesy everything and have a scribe rewrite everything down. I wonder if some of the mismatched order happened because of that incident,
I
perhaps.
think that happened twice.
Man, you had to do that twice. That would
Yeah.
wake up 3 weeks later. I remembered something else that's happened in this year of that rear person's reign. Got to add it to the end. Could have something to do with the order of it. So Jeremiah prophesies actually starting way back in the 13th year of Josiah, and Josiah had like a 31-year reign. So he was around for a lot of the good days of Josiah, as Josiah was returning to the Lord at that point in time, and there's a revival going on in Judah. Everybody's worshiping more righteously. They celebrate the greatest Passover that had been celebrated since the days of Samuel, even outstripped Hezekiah's Passover a few generations earlier. And I would imagine those were really good days for Jeremiah. At the same time, there's like this dark cloud because everybody knows that like we really, really walked away from God during the reigns of Manasseh and Ammon, and it's coming. It's just not yet. So, but he prophesies then through the following reigns of Jehoiaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah, and it continues actually a few more chapters in Jeremiah that actually land in the exile period. The book ends, his story ends. The book doesn't. They have to throw more chapters on at the end of his story in the book, but his story ends with him down in Egypt, and I'll explain how he gets to Egypt next week. Because you'd think he'd end up in Babylon, but nope, Jeremiah, Ezekiel and Daniel get to go to Babylon, and Jeremiah got a one-way ticket to Egypt.
Oh.
Also, was Egypt like a really unfaithful ally at the time or something?
Yeah, Egypt just always fell through. Every time you wanted to lean on Egypt, they just did not do well. This was as Egypt was coming to the end of its glory days. We used to have glory days, period. So they were very weak, and Not sure who invaded them the first time. I don't think the Babylonians did, but I think either Cyrus or Cambyses in the Persian Empire actually invades Egypt, and then the Egyptians are not self-ruling from that point forward.
Someone with the stab that pierces your hand. The stab
Yes.
that pierces your hands is about.
Yeah, they just were an inept ally at best. So, Book of Lamentations was also written by Jeremiah. It's kind of ironic in that it's considered one of the major prophets. Major because it was written by Jeremiah, who wrote a lot of the Old Testament, but it's only 5 chapters long. All poetry, mourning the fall of Jerusalem. We read a few verses out of chapter 3. It's one of those books that is not usually particularly exciting to read. I once had a friend who left a particularly demoralizing high school play, and he's like, I want to go cheer myself up, I'll read the Book of Lamentations or something. This is not usually a good way to cheer yourself up. But there is a moment of hope in the middle of it, right in the very middle of it actually, which is might actually have a chiastic structure to it now that I think about it. I'll have to dig through the Book of Lamentations to hunt for that, because it's doom, gloom, hope, gloom, doom. That's about how the book goes. So, other prophets. Obadiah, shortest minor prophet. He has a single chapter, and the whole book of prophecy is directed towards the kingdom of Edom, because the Edomites were rejoicing over seeing Jerusalem get laid siege and devastated, and the temple burned down and everything go bad. The Edomites had no good feelings for Judah, and they thought this was just amazing. God rebukes them and reminds them, your judgment is coming. And he actually reminds them of this awful thing that happened in a previous generation. Nope, that was a different kingdom.
Why is it that with the Edomites, they turned away from God generations before Israel even got there, but they were allowed to keep their land? But every time a generation of Israelites turned away from God, there was immediately they were destroyed.
Invaded oftentimes, not usually exiled until this point in time. But we don't hear about some of the judgments that come on other countries because the whole Bible revolves around Judah and Israel. And those other countries had issues that they had to deal with too. Oftentimes the Israelites came and subjected them. And so the Philistines were always under the thumb of the Israelites from David on, and there was only a handful of times that they were trying to rebel and regain their independence, and it didn't usually go well for them. So they were facing an awful lot, and the prophets actually have an awful lot of prophecies towards these neighboring kingdoms, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, warning them of judgments. And even Jonah, remember, he goes to Nineveh warning of a judgment coming because of their wickedness, but they repented, and so God relented. And then in a generation or two later, they didn't repent, and God didn't relent, and the Babylonians sacked Nineveh, and that was the end of the Assyrian Empire. So I think part of it is just the focus of the Bible on Israel and Judah, and we forget about the terrible things that happened to their neighbors too. Let's see. An interesting point of hope in there is the prophet Obadiah prophesies that Israel will be restored in the day and the hour of their destruction. There's still hope that the people of Jacob are coming back, but you guys, you're never going to come back. So it was hopeful at the same time for Judah. Habakkuk is an odd prophecy book or prophetic book because this actually takes the form of a conversation between the prophet Habakkuk and God. And it is usually plagued right towards the final days of the kingdom of Judah. But he has this conversation with God. Essentially, he's asking the question, why is it that the righteous are dying and the wicked seem to be thriving and doing well? Because this looks like an injustice on the surface. And God essentially answers him, their judgment is coming, just wait for it. And the theme of it comes across in chapter 2, in the verse there quoted. It says, though it linger, wait for it, it will certainly come and will not delay. And essentially Habakkuk was complaining about, it seems like it's going well for the wicked, and God was saying, give it a little more time frame and you'll have a different perspective on how well it went for the wicked versus the righteous. And that actually probably is reflecting some on that, where you see all the exiles getting taken off to Babylon with Jehoiakim, and those were the righteous people of Judah. They were getting spared the siege of Jerusalem and getting utterly devastated and going through the horrors of that experience. So it's interesting how God uses all kinds of different ways to preserve the righteous from judgment when the wicked get judged. Sometimes it takes a little more time for us to have a full perspective. That's what Habakkuk talks about. In Zephaniah, we should have covered 2 weeks ago because he prophesied in the days of Josiah. He actually was a great-great-grandson of Hezekiah, and so he was actually related to the king when he was prophesying. They were distant cousins, though, so if you know any third or fourth cousins, that would be the nature of their relationship. But he prophesies judgments coming on Judah, Philistia, Moab, Ammon, Cush, Assyria, and it was just kind of everybody who's around it's going to come on them in short order, and Assyria actually got it first. But Zephaniah is one of those books that makes better literature than it would a movie. There was one writer I remember reading about Zephaniah who said if Zephaniah were made into a movie, it would be an R-rated movie. It would not be suitable for most people to watch because it is vicious and graphic. So, fortunately, it's short.
It's a lot of the Bible.
Yes, a lot of the Bible is quite vicious and graphic, actually. All right. So that covers a few prophets. Now we come to the end of the kingdom era. Wanted to look at one thing here, because if you come across any other sources that try to date events in this period of the Old Testament or anything else, you're going to find massive discrepancies. And the reason for that is because there are differing chronologies that people put together, and any chronology is going to have its strengths and its weaknesses. The main two chronologies that I know of are the ones that we used by James Ussher, and that has the kingdom dividing in the year 975 and Jerusalem falling in the year 588. And there is 388 years in between there and a couple partial years on both ends. And much more commonly used today in most study Bibles, almost every dating system that I see, use a system that was generated by a guy by the name of Edwin Teal and perfected or worked on further by another guy by the last name of McFall. And you can see that they have some differences in when those things take place. So Teal and McFall have the division of the kingdom happening in 931 and Jerusalem falling in 586. So I wanted to point out one of the biggest discrepancies between these is their starting assumption. James Ussher assumed the biblical chronology is inspired word of God, so it's going to be correct, and will make the secular chronologies that have come down to us through the Greeks and the Assyrians fit into it where we can, and assume that the secular ones are incorrect. Whereas Teal and McFall, they're the assumption like we know the Assyrian chronology, and so we're going to try and squeeze the Bible into it. And that is why we end up with such discrepancies. There's 3 or 4 points at where Assyrian history crosses the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and they think they can get a date pegged on that. And so then they take everything that we just studied for the last couple of months and try and smush it in so that it fits really nicely and jives with the Assyrian chronology. That does awful violence to the scriptures, so I don't prefer that chronology. But I wanted you to be aware of it because you're never going to find James Ussher's dates used in anything contemporary these days. Which is kind of sad because 100 years ago, every Bible was printed with James Ussher's dates written into the margin of their Bible. So something would be taking place and it would say this is in 932, this is in 884, and so forth. And so it was really easy to read the Bible and be like, oh, that's when that happened, and have a really good chronology. So the way Teal and McFall try to reconcile the differences is they add a lot of co-regencies into their timeline. And this is one of the worst of them. So if you look on your genealogy that I handed out, up at the top there you have Amaziah, Uzziah, and Jotham. And they reign consecutively as the scriptures read it. And so you have Amaziah reigning for 29 years, and then you have Uzziah reigning for 52 years, and then Jotham reigns for about 16 years, I think. And it's pretty easy to read that straight out of the scripture, just one king, then the next king, and then the next king. Well, that doesn't work with the Assyrian chronology as they understand it and as they try to connect it to the scriptures, and so they have to get rid of an awful lot of years. And this is just one example, but what they do is they get a whole lot of overlapping reigns, so that while Amaziah is reigning for 29 years, 23 of those years his son Uzziah is reigning as a co-regent with him. Now there's nothing in the scriptures that would point to that actually happening. That's just the math that has to work to make their chronology work. And then Uzziah reigns for 18 years as the only king, and then for the last 11 years of his reign, Jotham is a regent. Now we know that Jotham reigned a little bit at the end of his reign, overlapping with his father, but the length of time is not specified, and it doesn't seem like he's full king at that point in time, but not 11 years. And that takes a 55-year reign and smushes it down to essentially 18 years. And they do that for Ahaz, and they do that for Hezekiah, and they do that for Manasseh. Anywhere place that they need to get rid of years, they just have kings overlapping in their reigns, even though there's no scriptural justification for it. See the problems that arises.
Is there a historical texts found that support this idea?
Yeah, that's where they dig up historical texts from the Assyrians, and they piece together the Assyrian chronology based on the lengths of reigns of Assyrian kings. And then there's one particular battle that the Assyrian chronology or Assyrian records reference, where the Assyrians are fighting against Jehu in Israel. And Jehu is one of the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, and they date that to a certain year in the 800s, and so that squeezes just a ton of time out of there. What they don't realize is that when the Assyrians were fighting against this particular Jehu, he may have just simply been a general that wasn't necessarily the king of the army.
Oh yeah, because there's another Jehu mentioned that wasn't the king as well. So
Mhm.
for all we know, it could have been a common name.
Yep, there's a few Jehus in the Old Testament that aren't the same guy. And the Assyrian chronology is like piecing together 45 fragments and trying to make sense of it. And that's not the same as like looking at the book of 2 Kings, where it's a cohesive single work and you can get it to interlock. And you have 2 Chronicles that also connects very well to it, and the two of them are mutually supportive instead of contradictory. And so you take 45 Assyrian sources and try to make them work out and then come up with something off of that, and then squeeze the Bible into it, it just ends up being messy. And so, as with almost everything in history, what you have to do is decide which chronology am I going to prioritize, and which one am I going to subordinate to it and squeeze into the other one. And so I always appreciate James Ussher's approach to it, because he assumes the scriptures are right. Not that our understanding of them is always absolutely correct, but scriptures are right so far as we can tell, and we will fit in the secular chronologies into them. One of the other things that always happened with the secular chronologies is that they are always trying to inflate the time that people reigned and the events of their reigns. So Sennacherib, remember we came across him when he laid siege to Jerusalem in the days of Hezekiah. James Ussher has him reigning a very short period of time, and the scriptures have him returning to Nineveh and then getting assassinated by two of his sons and then succeeded by a third son on top of that. And some people peg about 45 days in between there. But the secular history adds 14 years into that period of time. They have no idea what he did during those 14 years. There's nothing recorded about it. But he laid siege to Jerusalem at this year, and he died over here, so he had 14 years, and we don't know what happened in his reign, but something happened, and so they're inflating without any record there. 14 years. So that's the short version of why there are so many different or discrepancies as far as connecting the scriptural account into the BC AD dating system that we use today. One of the interesting things that I found in Ezekiel, though, is this prophecy here. Ezekiel has to lay on his side for 390 days, one day for every year that the sin, or for the sins of the people of Israel. And everybody I've ever heard refer to that passage dates that 390 years as counting from the fall of Jerusalem back to when the kingdom divided. And that is, as recorded in the scriptures, a 388-year period with a little partial year on the front end and a partial year on the back end. You remember how the Jews always counted partial years?
As a whole one.
As a whole year. Just like Jesus was in the grave for part of Friday, all of Saturday, and part of Sunday.
And it was
So he's
3 days.
3 days in the grave. They have 388 years, partial year and a partial year, and that gets us 390 years. And so you actually find that 390 years in James Ussher's dating system between 975 and 588. It's inclusive of 975. But you don't have that between 931 and 586. So that's the independent, inside the scripture look at how we actually date that period of time, which is convenient because it allows us to connect through the scriptures historically much easier. Well, that's the end of that. All right, next week, Alex is going to be sharing about some of the prophetic imagery out of Daniel, and we'll look at the exile period, which is mostly how it started and how it ended, because we don't know much about what happened in between, other than they plant gardens, they have children, they marry their sons and daughters. So